This is Professor Simon. For this week, for my episode 2 of my podcast series, Current Events That Shape History, I would like to discuss the Russo-Ukrainian War, or the ongoing war between Ukraine and Russia, which has really lasted close to 10 years, dating back to 2014. Let me know if you like this podcast, and you can subscribe to my channel below. Also, if you want to keep up with episodes and videos, for my YouTube channel. If you go back in history to under the Barack Obama and George W. Bush administrations, most of the main conflicts started then between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. I know people do not want to recognize that and only think of the current situation under Joe Biden's administration when President Vladimir Putin decided to invade the eastern part of Ukraine in 2022. But going back to that period, the United States in the West in general has wanted regime change in Ukraine to make it more Western-oriented and supportive with NATO interests, like in Europe, starting with the Maidan Revolution in February of 2014, also known as the Ukrainian or Dignity Revolution. The Ukrainians became even more aligned with the West. This helped to create, friction with Russia, who kind of sees Ukraine as their sphere of influence. But also, if you know much about the geography of Ukraine, many of the natural resources that they have, Russia and Ukraine have the most oil and natural gas in Europe, which gives, Russia great economic leverage in that region, especially in dealing with other European countries, like Germany or also Poland. This led to Vladimir Putin seizing and occupying Crimea, alongside with being incredibly supportive of pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine that want to, break away from the Ukrainian state. This caused the outbreak of the Donbass War in the Donbass region provinces of Donetsk and also Luhansk to protect these separatists. What happened in February of 2022, Putin recognized these as independent, self-proclaimed republics. And then they, of course, began an invasion of the eastern part of the Ukraine. This caused a wider conflict to open up, which has become one of the largest and bloodiest conflicts since really World War II in Europe. So the outcome of this conflict is really going to have an effect on Europe overall. With the United States and NATO countries sending billions in military aid to Ukraine, this has caused the war to escalate, and both sides have suffered high casualty amounts. I'm not sure if they exactly know how many the figures are, but I think on both sides, both have probably suffered close to several 100,000 killed and wounded in the war. Propaganda has also been used by both sides to galvanize the war effort and drum up support from various allies. Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, has done a great deal of campaigning to get, quite a lot of Western aid to continue the fight against Russian aggression. Currently, at the making of this podcast, this war, the main part of the war, anyway, of this conflict, has been going on for about 2.5 years. As a historian, my great question about the ongoing Ukrainian war conflict with Russia is, can the West win the war against Russia, or is the outcome, as in many historical conflicts in that part of Eastern Europe, dead on arrival? I have studied various historical conflicts in Eastern Europe, and I have read a great deal on the history of Russia, especially more on the modern Russia in the 20th century. I've studied a lot on the Soviet Union. But if you study modern history, various European powers have not fared well fighting in Russia going back to the time of Tsar Peter the Great, around the last 300 years ago. This includes wars against the Ottoman Empire, where Russia fought the Turks in numerous wars, like under Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. They had the Swedish Empire, tried to fight Russia in the Great Northern War under King Charles XII. They lost that war. Prussia didn't fare well with Russia either in the 7 Years' War. France, of course, most famously with Emperor Napoleon I, tried to invade Russia in 1812, which the Russians called the Patriotic War. Well, we know what happened with that. Napoleon's forces were almost annihilated. Finland didn't fare well either. They fought several wars against the Soviet Union, the Winter War, the Continuation War, and they sided with Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front. They didn't do well either. And then Nazi Germany, of course, famously lost the Soviets in World War II. So all these countries that fought the Russians were eventually defeated over time, not just because of the Russian military presence in that region, but I think the major factor was just the huge vastness of Russia's geography. Just trying to, conquer it or invade it is very difficult. The Russians were also known for famously using scorched earth policies when, various countries would invade them. And I know in World War II, the Soviets just used overwhelming force to defeat their enemy, like multiple attack waves of forces, just almost like a meat grinder trying to defeat the enemy. Probably a good example of that was the Vistula-Oder offensive in World War II, where the Soviet forces used an overwhelming army of 2 million troops to push the Germans back on a 300-mile front. They pushed them back from Poland into Germany in just 2 weeks. And that was considered one of the main events that really led to the defeat of Nazi Germany, especially on the Eastern Front in World War II. However, the Soviets, if you know about it, they lost around 10 million men trying to fight Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front to defeat fascism. And then civilian losses were even higher, somewhere between 10 to 20 million. So, the Soviets are, the Germans and the Soviets, that was a brutal war. If you know about the Eastern Front in World War II, one of the bloodiest, conflicts really in human history. Now, there have been some wars where the West defeated Russia militarily. I can kind of go through 2 examples of that. If you want to count the Cold War era, you can, but that was more like an economic political standoff between the West and, communism, not really direct, military wars. But examples of where, the West defeated Russia, you had the Crimean War in the 1850s, 19th century, and then World War I, don't forget the Great War between 1914 and 1918. The only problem with those wars is that they were fought successfully because of coalition forces that were involved. Like in the Crimean War, you had a combination of the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, fought with the British and the French. Their empires, they were able to defeat, a weakening Russian Empire under Tsar Nicholas I and later Tsar Alexander II, where they fought mostly around the northern Black Sea region. So that was a good example of, where the West defeated Russia in, Eastern Europe. Going back to the reign of Empress Catherine the Great in the 1780s, the Crimea, was seen as the jewel, the vast empire of Russia, which, stretched from Eastern Europe all the way Siberia into Alaska. And about Russia, back then it was, one of the largest and is the largest geographical state in the world and still is today. Crimean Peninsula was kind of seen as, being very important to the Russian naval power for that region due to the presence of their Black Sea fleet. And so during the Crimean War, if you know what happened, the coalition forces of the West seized the Crimean Peninsula. They had this so-called siege of Sevastopol. and the Russians were forced to scuttle their Black Sea fleet. That's one of the things that happened, during that war. And so I think that's kind of partially why, if you think about Vladimir Putin, maybe why he seized, control of the Crimea back in 2014. In a certain way, it was to seek revenge on the West, for what happened in the 1850s. And Putin, if you know about him, one of his favorite czars is Nicholas I. I think he likes Nicholas I because he kind of sees how he tried to stand up to the West, because the West was becoming like an imperialistic power, like under the British Empire under Queen Victoria. You had their ally, the French Empire under, Napoleon III, Emperor Napoleon III. And so the Russians wanted to try to retain their naval power throughout that region. And I guess the Russians kind of view that area of Ukraine as almost like part of their Russian world, or at least, part of their sphere of influence, is what they kind of feel. And to the Russians, the threat of NATO, at their western border is almost akin to similar aggressions by Western powers in the 19th century, which we saw with the Crimean War. The other successful conflict where Russia was defeated occurred in World War I, the First World War, where the Central Powers on the Eastern Front, with a coalition of forces, also defeated the Russian Empire that was starting to become the Soviet Union after the Russian Revolution broke out in 1917. The German Empire was under the leadership of Kaiser Wilhelm II, who fought with the Austro-Hungarian Empire with the Central Powers, and so they were able to defeat a weakening Russia, which was ruled by Tsar Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia. And don't forget that the Germans, you think about this in the West, were aided by the Ottoman Empire. They had joined the Central Powers during the war, and they helped effectively block Russian aid through the Black Sea region. That was part of why the war was so difficult for Russia. It wasn't just the fact that, you had the Russian Revolution break out later in 1917, but you had a declining Russia where they were, blockaded, by, of course, the Turks. Now, what happened was the Central Powers were able to drive the Russians back into the Ukraine. They took over the Crimea. They seized control of the Baltic states, pretty much took control of Poland, and even took over Finland as well, which had been, part of Russia before that. And this sparked, if you know about it, the so-called White Movement after World War I, where many states that were around Russia, like west of Russia, broke away, and they formed these non-communist states that we know today that were later in the West, like Finland and Poland and so on. And what happened was the West came in, like a lot of allies began to support the Russian white armies during the so-called Russian Civil War that broke out after Vladimir Lenin and the Bolshevik communists tried to take over Russia. And so what occurred was that eventually the Soviet Union won the Civil War. They took over, and the Soviet Union was formed. This sowed a lot of great deal of mistrust and resentment towards the West, which still exists today. A lot of people don't understand this, but many of the tensions between Russia and the West date back to when the Soviet Union formed, not just during the Cold War. It goes back to like the 1920s. There's also been this fear of the Russian bear, taking over the world. And some believe that part of the West's strategic goal, especially the United States, is to weaken or break up Russia, like the Russian Federation, break it up. But I believe that the U.S. government in the last 20, 30 years has created more tensions with Russia due to a lot of the military-industrial complex, like the CIA, the Pentagon. I think they want to kind of resurrect the Cold War with Russia. And if you know about Ronald Reagan back in the 1980s as president, had helped to end the Cold War, where they got, the Soviet Union in an arms race. And Reagan also fixed the economy in the United States But, starting in the 1990s, presidents like Bill Clinton, then George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, currently Joe Biden, under those presidents, the United States has been moving more, I think, towards aggression, again, towards Russia, also China and Iran as well. And this could be very well a new Cold War era that's forming again, like a Cold War II, that kind of thing. And you have all these new alliances that are forming throughout the world, like Russia and China and other countries, North Korea, Iran, kind of merging together. Now, with the current ongoing conflict between Ukraine and the West against the Russian Federation, it seems that the war has mostly become a stalemate due to the continued military aid that the United States, NATO, and the European Union has given as a response to the Russian invasion, going back to 2022. I think Vladimir Putin could have likely won the war in 2022 if the Russians had used a larger and stronger force to seize the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv, similar to what the United States and coalition forces did during the Iraq War under President George W. Bush, when we tried to take out and did President Saddam Hussein when we invaded Iraq in 2003. About it, what happened? We invaded and we took their capital. But with, enough forces. But I think due to not acting decisively in such a conflict, this allowed the Ukrainian forces to regroup with Western aid, and it caused the current stalemate that the war is in now. I think that the West, which includes the United States and NATO powers, cannot win this war decisively without direct military intervention. This is likely to remain a continuing boondoggle that drains billions of dollars in wasted military spending, and especially men that are killed and wounded on the battlefield. From a war that seems to not have an end to it, kind of like Vietnam was. And so I'm worried about the fact that this might be a similar outcome to the failed wars we've already had before, not just Vietnam, but Afghanistan, what happened there, and then before what happened with Iraq also as well. I think also that direct intervention by the West could trigger World War III, which in the end might be more devastating for not only the United States and Russia, but the world in general. Do we really want a nuclear war with Russia is a big question. I think that either side, Russia or the West, will eventually have to come to its senses and seek some type of mediation between Russia and Ukraine. This may not be a positive outcome for the Ukrainians, as they may end up losing considerable territory after the conflict ends, likely not getting back the Crimea. But I do not think that the war is winnable for the West, as the conflict continues indefinitely. The famous Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu once said that the true objective of war is peace. Both sides may want to fight on in this bloody conflict, but in the end, they must both fight for peace instead. This is Professor Simon, and that's the way history is.